Hello, and thanks for tuning in to another episode of Quillbilly Garage. I appreciate you tuning in. I hope you're enjoying the series. This series is called 1934 Ford Sedan Resurrection. For this episode, I'm going to do the rest of the brakes. You saw in a previous episode how I mounted the master cylinder and hooked it up to the brake pedal. And for this episode, I'm going to try and just cover the whole rest of the brakes in that. I don't intend on drawing it out, showing every little detail. I don't think you guys would stay watching if I did all of that in one episode. I do plan to touch on little points of interest along the way, how I'm doing things, what I'm learning, and a little bit of family history as it pops up. And so today, as you can see, I've already pulled the wheels off. This car, you may remember from a previous episode, sat at my grandparents' house out in the desert for decades before my dad brought it to our house. As I pull the car apart, I find little remnants showing the history of the car. So remembering that it sat out in the desert all those years, and I pointed this part out before, but you can see those tires have still has the sand embedded in the rubber from where the car was sitting out in the desert next to my grandparents' house. This wheel here is the only one that still had the hubcap on it from back from 1975 when my dad put these tires on the car. So this is the hubcap, and as I was popping it off, desert sand was falling out on the ground. I just wanted to catch some of these little tidbits before I clean things up. I'm going to clean all the dust off before I pull the grease cap off. Another point of interest, behind the hubcap, there were these old leaves back in there sitting inside the wheel. And my grandparents, they had poplars and elm trees, a lilac, and some things like that. And those leaves, I don't know my leaves, but those probably came off of one of the elm trees, I'm guessing. In preparation for removing the front brake drums, I've already pulled off the front grease seals. Point of interest, so I'm used to more modern cars, and when I say modern, I mean like from the 60s. And the grease caps on those, they're just a friction fit in there, and you take a pair of pliers or something and pop them out. But you'll notice here, the grease caps actually have a hex head to them, and they are threaded. So I'm glad I learned that before beating the heck out of these caps trying to get them off. On the rear drums, you need a special puller to remove the hub off the axle shaft. And there's a few different styles of pullers. This is one of the ones I have, and I think it's quite nice, quite effective. So these two pieces will clamp onto that. And then there's the center shaft that'll push against the end of the axle. Notice there's a hole in the end of the axle, and there's a little point on the end of the puller center shaft that'll keep that aligned. This thing's pretty cool, pretty sturdy. Notice for moving these around, the captured nut there, you don't have to put a wrench on it because the arm holds it in place. Let's see if I can do this one-handed. Probably not. So you see how it lines up. So then we'll screw the shaft out so we can grab the ears on the end of the hub snout. Do a little bit of this off camera here. So there you see I've got it mounted up to the hub, and there's a couple of ways I could go about this. You could either take a wrench and tighten that, or a socket and an impact gun. But if it's really hard on this, there's this attachment that you can put on there and beat it with a hammer. And I don't think we'll need to do that on this one. I've actually had this drum off recently. It should come off pretty well. I've got all 4 drums off. They all came off pretty easily. For the sake of saving some screen time here, I'll show you just one of the rears and one of the fronts. But remembering that my dad did the brakes on this in 1975, and then the car was really not driven much at all, maybe just a few miles. And also remembering that my main goal here is a resurrection, not a full-on restoration. I'm excited to get it on the road. Once I get it on the road, I'll start discovering other things that need attention. Things will start leaking, I'm sure. So that said, I'm not replacing the brake shoes. I'm just replacing the wheel cylinders and the lines that go to the wheel cylinders. You already saw that I replaced the master cylinder. And here's the front. Again, the brake shoes got plenty of meat on them. You may remember from an earlier video me explaining how when they converted this from mechanical brakes to hydraulic, they used 1937 to 1941 Ford Spindles, also called round-back spindles. And those were used because the hydraulic brakes, the hydraulic backing plates would bolt to them. I noticed, and you can see it there, it's written upside down from the way we're standing, but it says right here in like a marker or grease pencil, it says 28 to 34. Probably indicating that that's what to use to put hydraulic brakes on a 28 to 34 Ford. I'm not sure why they skipped 35 and 36. Maybe there's something about these spindles that won't go on a 35 or 36, but I doubt it. That doesn't make any sense to me. So anyway, there's a mystery. I'll probably never know why. But another point of interest, kind of off the subject of the brakes, back to the steering. The original spindles would have had an additional arm coming off of them to connect the drag link to the pitman arm. Well, these 37 to 41 spindles don't have that arm. And so there's this aftermarket arm up top that bolts right through the spindle. You can see the nuts right there. And that is what the drag link hooks to when you do this conversion. It changes the geometry a little bit. If it were factory, the drag link wouldn't be at such an upward angle. I don't know if that change in geometry with the drag link is noticeable when driving the car. It's possible that the only difference might be that maybe the steering wheel wouldn't be exactly centered. So that remains to be seen when I get the car back together and on the road. Something I noticed about this steering arm that bolts through the upper 2 bolts of the spindle, something that I don't like. I don't know if you can tell here in the picture, but there is a castle nut on each one of the threaded rods that comes through. And there's no cotter key holding them from backing off. And I think you can see here, the nut goes down too far. Even if there was a cotter key in there, it wouldn't catch one of the grooves in the castle nut. So I'm going to need to figure out something to do about that. Might be stacking a couple of washers behind those nuts so that they stick out closer to where the hole is through the shaft. But I'll worry about that later. I'm going to keep going with the brakes here. As you can see here, I pulled the spring off so I could spread the brake shoes apart and replace the wheel cylinders. And I made this discovery. We've got the new wheel cylinder on the left, the old one on the right, And I verified with the part number on the box that this is indeed the left front wheel cylinder. And as you can see here, they're mirror images of each other. So these wheel cylinders were on the wrong side all these years. Differences being where the brake hose bolts on, it would be pointing a different direction. And I mean, they look different. The housings are different as well. Now, I don't know if there's any reason why they wouldn't work the way they were. They obviously did work. I don't know if there's something about the design that's pushing more on one side than the other. I doubt it, but if somebody knows and wants to chime in the comments, I'd appreciate that. You'll notice that the wheel cylinders only have 3 bolt holes, while the backing plates have 4. So I'm going to go ahead and put the correct side on the correct side and go from there. Now I've got all 4 wheel cylinders installed. I did confirm with a friend that yes, indeed, I have put the wheel cylinders on the correct side. The larger diameter portion is to face the front of the car. So the wheel cylinders that were on the car, they on the front anyhow, were indeed installed on the wrong sides. Now I've got all the brake springs back in place. We might as well take a little walk around. Still have to sort out the parking brake. This parking brake cable is going to come out and I've got a new one to install. I'll get to that a bit later. One thing I haven't figured out how to address, there's a couple of brake shoe adjusters on the back side of the backing plate. And if you see here, it's kind of hidden behind the spring mount. And I'm going to have to see if I have some kind of a wrench that'll fit there. Tight spot. And next I'm going to work on the brake lines, the steel brake lines and the hoses. When this was converted, back in the 50s or 60s, they drilled a hole in the inner fender there and mounted the brake hose through there. I'm not going to use that hole. I'm going to use this bracket that will mount up behind the shock. Here, so you can see it better. And it has that hole that'll hang down below the frame, and that's what I'm going to mount the brake hose to. I've got the new front brake hose brackets in place, mounted between the shock and the frame. As you can see, I set one of the brake hoses in place just so you can get a full picture of what that's going to look like when it's together. I did run into one problem when I took the shock off. Discovered that it is seized up. I cannot get this shock arm to budge. I put a little bar on it for leverage, but I cannot get it to flex down enough to reconnect the dog bone connector link. So that's a subject for another video. Ran into some other problems that I'll touch on later. The new steel brake line is going to connect to the back side of that hose and then cross over probably behind this lip of the front cross member. However, as I was looking at that, and I don't think you can see it too well in this picture, but I found that my cross member is damaged and has a botched or just a poor quality repair probably done back in the 50s or 60s that I need to look deeper into and get that sorted out before I run the front steel brake lines. So for this segment of the resurrection, I will continue on with the brakes and focus on the back. So you can see, let me get under it here. The old steel lines here, I'm going to replace all of those. You can see the old connector where they came together. That's all coming out and getting replaced with new stuff connected to the new master cylinder. So, working on the rear brake lines, I bought from the local parts store a couple of 60-inch ready-made quarter-inch brake lines. Generally, I shy away from cutting my own tubing and putting my own flares on it. So I buy the closest length to what I need and get creative making up with the excess material. So as you can see, looking pretty good. Looking good until you get here. And then I had a little bit more excess than I knew what to deal with. And that's what it looks like. So, not real professional. So today I came out and I was going to make the other side, and I immediately made a mistake of sliding the nut down before making the bend. I was making this piece right here, and I had the nut past where I made the bend, so then I couldn't get the nut back up, and I couldn't straighten it out well enough to get it in place. So I cut the end off, and I thought, all right, well, here's the opportunity to make it the right length. So my son, one of my teenage sons, I asked if he wanted to give it a shot, and he did. And he did beautifully. Makes the bend here and goes up into the wheel cylinder. Now the one thing that happened, I told him always make sure that you put the nut on and put it on the right way before you make the flare. And he promptly did the flare, looked over, realized that he hadn't put the nut on. So this one ended up being a little bit shorter than we wanted. We wanted a little more space here between the tubing and that nut on the radius rod. But really, he did a great job. Compliments to my son. He's got a great attention to detail, and he did a much better job bending these steel lines than I did. So that said, he's going to make a new one to replace the one that I installed. Back under the car here, I have finished installing the brake lines that go from the master cylinder forward. That line up there goes and follows the inside curve of the X member. Comes out here, and I've got a union going to another piece of line. Follows the frame rail just above the frame rail, and then here's where it comes out down below and ties into the brake hose. All that's left to do is the crossover piece. I had intended to use this pre-bent crossover piece that would go in here, but there's two reasons I'm not using it yet. First reason being, I've got an issue with my crossmember here. You can't really tell what you're looking at maybe, but it's broken out up there, and there was an old weld job done that's broken out, and things they're not sitting quite right. And so that crossover piece is supposed to sit behind the flange here, but with the way things are, there's not room to get it there. And I'm afraid that even if there was, I'm afraid I've got some movement that's going to happen when this car's on the road that might damage the line or pinch it. I do intend on fixing the Crossmember, but not yet. So the second reason I wasn't going to use that piece yet is I'm missing the correct T and fittings to connect here. So in an effort to get this together, because there's so many different things that block progress with the project, I don't want to get hung up on little things, because if I do, I'll get hung up on every little thing. So my intention is to run a crossover line essentially straight across, but farther back on this cross member, keeping it away from this whole assembly. So in trying to figure out how to make this work without waiting for more parts to order, I remembered that I had an old assortment of brake line fittings that someone gave me maybe 15 years ago. I've never used them. Thought about throwing them away a couple of times, because when would I ever use them? But now's the time, and I went and found them, knew right where they were. And one of these T's is just what I needed. So that's what I used to connect the hose to the line coming forward, and then we'll connect the crossover line here. One of my sons is, as we speak, bending up a crossover line to go across. And here he is finishing up the double flare on the other end of it. So here pretty soon we will have the brake system fully connected. My son has finished up making the front crossover piece, got it installed, and he did a first-rate job getting it bent to shape, curving around the contours of the cross member and such. So at this point, the hydraulic system for the brakes is all connected. All the fittings are in place and tightened up. Just doing a final walkthrough, looking at the finished product. Again, those rear lines that my son made just look great. Much better than the ones that I tried to make. So thank you for tuning into this episode of Quillbilly Garage on my 34 Ford Resurrection. Please watch for new videos as I continue on this project, and thanks again for tuning in.